Mr. Chairman, I rise today to offer an amendment to improve research and public awareness of opioid use during pregnancy. I introduced the POPI Study Act earlier this year. This issue is to address this issue, and I'm pleased that it's being considered here today in this forum. We all know that opioid epidemic has widespread and devastating effects. Nearly all of us know someone who's been affected by the crisis, and many of us have grieved through the heartbreak of losing loved ones to addiction. Sadly, the impact this has had on Utah has been overwhelming. In my state, 6 Utahns die every week as a result of the opioid overdose, and we rank among the highest in the nation for drug overdose deaths. Areas of my district have some of the highest rates of opioid prescription dispensed nationwide. Tragically, Utah also leads out in prescribing the most opioids to pregnant women. Across the nation, 1 in 5 women receive an opioid prescription during pregnancy, but in Utah, that number is doubled. Of course, opioid use during pregnancy can have dramatic consequences for a mother and her unborn child. Neonatal abstinence syndrome presents itself as babies go through withdrawal. Constant screaming, shaking, vomiting, and difficult sleeping and eating. This condition often requires long and expensive hospitalization. For Medicaid-covered babies, this syndrome cost over $460 million in 2014 alone. Tragically, from 2004 to 2014, the rate of infants diagnosed with opioid withdrawal symptoms increased over 400% nationwide. Across the nation, women have been disproportionately impacted by the opioid epidemic, and little is known about the effect this has had on pregnant women. Healthcare experts, providers, and patients agree there is simply too much we don't know about why pregnant women are being prescribed opioids and what possible alternatives might provide better health care outcomes for mothers and their unborn children. My amendment calls for increased research on current opioid prescribing practices during pregnancy, more data on prescription opioid misuse during pregnancy, and evaluates and encourages non-opioid pain management therapies that are safe and effective during pregnancy. I'm proud of the work we've done here to curb opioid epidemic, and I applaud the chairman, ranking member, and members of the committee for the work they have done to fight this crisis. I encourage my colleagues to support this vital amendment as well as the underlying bill that will help us better serve our suffering communities. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Does anyone seek time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, although I'm not opposed to the amendment, I ask unanimous consent to claim time in opposition.
Without objection. The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I rise to speak in support of the amendment and to thank my friend from Utah, Mr. Curtis, for his hard work on this very thoughtful piece of legislation. It's important that women who take opioid pain medications are aware of the possible risks during pregnancy. You've heard him delineate those tragic risks, such as premature birth, neonatal abstinence syndrome, or NAS. While there is increasing awareness and use of non-opioid approaches in the management of pain overall, information about their use in pregnant patients and the unique considerations of mother and child are simply lacking. So this amendment requires the Department of Health and Human Services to report on the opioid prescribing practices and opioid misuse during pregnancy and evaluate non-opioid alternatives to pain management during pregnancy. This will complement the efforts of the Protecting Our Infants Act, which required a report on prenatal opioid exposure and NAS, presenting a strategy and clinical recommendations for preventing and treating infant withdrawal. And I encourage my colleagues to support this amendment, and I'd now like to recognize my friend, a very important member not only of the U.S. House of Representatives as our whip, but a very influential and effective member on our Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Scalise, for such time as he may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for yielding and for leading on this important issue. And I rise in strong support of my friend from Utah's amendment. And as he mentioned, Mr. Speaker, you look at this crisis in our country, and I'm so glad that Congress is taking a wide array of action to address the opioid crisis in our country, because it doesn't just affect one community or another. Everybody might think mine is the only problem. And then you talk to other members of Congress from around the country and you find out they're experiencing the same kind of crisis, and it's widespread. It's killing people every single day. But as we're talking about on this amendment, Mr. Speaker, we're talking about children. Children that are born to a mother that's addicted to opioids. I highlight Kemper, a young boy from my district in Slidell, Louisiana. He was born addicted to opioids because his mother, while he was pregnant, was addicted to opioids herself. Now, I wish that this was the only time that it had happened. Fortunately, for all of us, Kemper is now a healthy young boy. But he spent his first 11 days of life in the hospital fighting to beat a drug addiction that was not created, of course, on his own. We'd like to think that this might be an isolated example, but Mr. Speaker, this example highlights something the Centers for Disease Control has noted, and that is once every 25 minutes in America, a baby is born addicted to opioids. Once every 25 minutes. That's how widespread it is, just for babies that are born. And so when we talk about this entire package of bills, and today H.R. 6 is going to pull together 50 different bills covering many different parts of this problem. And it's an incredibly bipartisan effort. And I know, Mr. Speaker, so often we hear about the partisan wrangling in Congress, and clearly there are divided lines on some high-profile issues. But this is an issue where Republicans and Democrats have come together. And I want to thank my friends from both sides of the aisle for recognizing this problem and coming together with a bipartisan way to solve it. This is going to give real tools to our communities so that they can combat this at every different level we're seeing it, including treatment, including law enforcement, to stop these deadly drugs from getting on the streets so that more babies like Kemper are not born addicted to opioids. I encourage all my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying package of bills, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
I reserve.
Oregon reserves. The gentleman from Utah reserves.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Oregon.
Yeah, we have no other speakers on our side, I think, seeking recognition on this amendment. I'd urge passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the gentleman from Louisiana and the chairman for their speaking out in support of this important bill. Mr. Chairman, this amendment is essential in helping us improve our understanding of the impact of using opioid prescription during pregnancy and ultimately preventing opioid use disorder entirely. It is vital that we have sound and accurate research to guide us in the best ways to help pregnant women suffering from addiction. This is a critical amendment, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.